DVB Digital Fast.
Hello and welcome to DVB Interview. I'm your host Myanmar. Joining me today is Benedict Rogers, the Senior Director at Fortify Rights. Thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure. It's good to be with you again.
My first question is, ASEAN held an informal meeting with Myanmar regime Foreign Minister Tharman Shui on July 12. Do you think that ASEAN is now following China and India in legitimizing his region in Naypyidaw?
Well, it certainly is concerning, and it looks as if it may be moving in that direction. I know that within ASEAN there are different opinions. I think countries like Malaysia, which previously had the chairmanship of ASEAN, and the Philippines, the current chair, and Singapore, may hold a somewhat more robust line on Myanmar, whereas other countries want to engage and legitimize the regime more. But overall, it's worrying that after China and India, we now see more engagement from ASEAN, and that risks legitimizing a regime that deserves no legitimacy or credibility.
Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted Myanmar as his counterpart in Beijing in June. How do you view this move by China?
Well, again, I think it's very concerning that China has clearly sided with the regime. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, it wasn't entirely clear where China stood, and at the time it was reported that China was not actually very happy with the coup. But clearly over the last 5 years it's moved to put all its cards on the side of the regime, and it's doing so politically in terms of legitimizing the regime, but obviously it's supporting the regime massively with economic investment, with military support, arms, and diplomatic support internationally. So I think that's very concerning.
So you've been documenting human rights violations in Myanmar and China for several decades. How have things changed since the 2021 military coup?
Oh, I think clearly the situation in Myanmar has become far, far worse than it has ever been in recent decades since the coup. The human rights situation in Myanmar has always been extremely bad, but the level that it has reached in the last 5 years, I think, far outstrips what happened before, particularly in terms of the use of airstrikes. When I first started working on Myanmar 25 years ago, the attacks that were taking place, particularly in the ethnic areas, were ground attacks by troops, and they were doing terrible things. They were using human minesweepers, there was sexual violence, there was the destruction of villages, displacement of thousands of people. But now the military is using airstrikes, and not only from fighter jets, but also drones and paramotors and gyrocopters, these kind of new forms of technology and equipment. So it's a really dire human rights crisis that the world needs to wake up to.
It's been over 5 years since the coup. So how would you assess the current human rights situation in Myanmar?
I would say it's one of the worst human rights situations in the world, but it's not receiving the attention that it deserves. And that's partly because in the world today we have so many crises, from Putin's war in Ukraine, Gaza, of course the current crisis in Iran, and many other situations. But Myanmar deserves to be up there among all these other situations in terms of getting attention and international action, because what's happening, both in terms of airstrikes, in terms of the number of political prisoners. For a long time after the coup, until fairly recently, I think the number of political prisoners was around 22,000. I know there have been some releases in recent months, but still I think the number is around 14,000 now, which is far higher than it ever was under previous military regimes. I remember under the Than Shwe regime, I think the highest number of political prisoners was around 2,000 to 3,000, and that's a terrible number. I mean, one political prisoner is one too many, but for there to be 22,000 or 14,000 now is really shocking. So it is one of the worst human rights situations in the world, and it needs much more attention and action from the international community.
So what do you see as the biggest obstacle to stopping the military's atrocities?
I think probably the support that it's receiving from China and Russia in terms of finance and military equipment is the biggest obstacle. If it didn't have the air power that it has, I think there's a reasonable chance that the opposition pro-democracy armed groups could have potentially succeeded or certainly gained much more ground. And when I was in the region about a year ago, it looked very much like the military was on the back foot and the opposition forces were gaining ground. But it now looks like the military is advancing again, and that's largely because it has air power and it has many more arms than the opposition, and that's largely coming from China and Russia. I think the other obstacle is the support it's getting. Not necessarily militarily, but certainly economically and diplomatically from other countries like India and ASEAN.
There have also been increasing reports of abuses committed by resistance forces in Myanmar. So how does Fortify Rights assess and report these allegations?
Well, Fortify Rights believes very much in human rights for everyone and in treating human rights violations independently, documenting, researching and exposing them. So where violations do take place by opposition groups, we haven't shied away from reporting them. We've done that particularly in the case of some of the abuses by the AA, the Arakan Army, and also groups like ARSA. So we very much believe in exposing human rights violations, whoever they're committed by, and seeking accountability and justice.
What is the current status of the Rohingya genocide case against Myanmar at the ICJ and those under universal jurisdiction?
So the case at the ICJ in The Hague, Fortify Rights founder and CEO Matthew Smith spent several weeks in The Hague earlier this year during as the case was proceeding. We're now awaiting the ICJ's judgment, and we don't know exactly when that will come. I think we can safely assume that it will come before the end of the year, we hope, but we'll have to wait and see. In terms of the universal jurisdiction cases, there are several at different stages. Obviously, there was a case in Argentina some while ago. There's the very beginnings of possible cases opening in Timor-Leste and Indonesia, and they're all at different stages of advancement. But I think universal jurisdiction is a tool that should be used wherever possible, and I welcome the fact that these cases are underway.
Do you believe these legal proceedings can deliver justice for victims in Myanmar, including Rohingya?
I believe they can. I think if there is a truly independent judicial process that looks at the evidence that is presented to them, matches that evidence with what international law says about human rights violations, then I have confidence that justice can be done.
What more can the international community do to hold Myanmar's military accountable for crimes it has committed?
I think, first of all, the international community should be paying much more attention to Myanmar. And there have been multiple warnings, not only from human rights NGOs, but from, for example, the previous United Nations Special Rapporteur, Tom Andrews, and also the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who've both been very outspoken within the UN system about how grave the situation in Myanmar is. And it's a matter of political will for member states within the UN to really step up. So I hope that will happen. I hope that countries that believe in democracy and human rights will find ways to counter those that are trying to legitimize the regime. And most of all, I think two steps are needed to hold the regime to account. One is the judicial mechanisms that we've just spoken about, the ICJ and universal jurisdiction. But the other is greater enforcement and implementation of targeted sanctions, not sanctions against the people of Myanmar, but sanctions against the military and their enterprises. And of course, there are some sanctions in place by the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, and some others. But the UK, for example, has not imposed any new sanctions for some time now, and certainly not since the sham elections. So I think there's a need for the UK and other countries to impose new sanctions, to send a signal that we don't accept this regime that is in power because of sham elections, a sham parliament, and we should be enforcing those sanctions. Basically, the way to address the situation is to try to do everything possible to cut the lifelines of support for the regime, financial lifelines, diplomatic lifelines, military lifelines. There should be enforcement of an international arms embargo. There should be action to stop the supply of jet fuel to the military that enables them to carry out their airstrikes. And there should be increased efforts to hold the regime and the perpetrators of human rights violations to account.
How is Fortify Rights working with civil society organizations inside and outside of Myanmar to document atrocities by the military?
Well, a key part of Fortify Rights work, and I think one of the things that makes us somewhat distinct from many other human rights organizations, is that we focus a lot on strengthening local human rights defenders. And we've done that in recent months through training. Some of my colleagues were recently in Karenni State providing training to local groups there in international humanitarian law and human rights, and documentation skills. And we do that sort of thing in other places as well. So I think it's really important that we work together with local Myanmar civil society and human rights defenders to strengthen their capacity to document what's happening on the ground.
There was genocide determination bill recently introduced in the UK Parliament. This bill would allow UK courts to make preliminary determinations on allegations of genocide committed overseas. So how could this help survivors seeking justice for atrocities committed in Myanmar?
Well, this bill, I think, is an incredibly important piece of legislation. It's been introduced by Lord Alton, who's been a long-standing human rights champion, a long-time voice on Myanmar, and he's also a member of Fortify Rights Leadership Council. And he has been pursuing this issue for some years because the problem at the moment in the UK is that the British government uses the argument that governments shouldn't determine genocide, politicians shouldn't determine genocide. They argue it's a legal matter that should be determined by the courts. But the problem is the courts in the UK are not currently empowered to make that determination. So it's a kind of vicious cycle of the government saying they can't make the determination, it should be made by the courts, but the courts can't do it. And therefore we're in this sort of stalemate where nobody declares a genocide and therefore nobody does anything to prevent or punish genocide. So this bill will, if it passes, will empower the High Court of England and Wales and the equivalent court in Scotland to receive submissions from either survivors of a possible genocide or human rights organisations acting on behalf of survivors who would be able to submit to the court evidence, and then it will be left to an independent court of judges with extensive experience in the law to assess that evidence and make a determination of genocide. And if they do make that determination, then under the law, this bill, which would become law if it passes, the British government would then be required to take certain steps, for example, to refer the case to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, to impose sanctions and other measures. So I think it's a groundbreaking bill because it will break this deadlock of the government saying it can't determine genocide, but the courts not being empowered to do so. It would provide a way forward in the UK to address genocide, and I think it would be a very significant step forward.
Fortify Rights has called on the UK to lead efforts to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court under Article 14 of the Rome Statute. If the genocide determination bill becomes law, how could it accelerate the case against Myanmar?
Well, it could certainly accelerate the case because if this bill becomes law, people from Myanmar or organisations on their behalf would be able to submit evidence to the High Court in England and Wales or the equivalent court in Scotland. And if those courts make a determination that it is genocide, and that may be in the case of the Rohingya, it may relate to other issues potentially. If that determination is made, then the British government would be required under that law, if it becomes law, to take action, and that could include seeking a referral against Min Aung Hlaing to the International Criminal Court. So it could certainly accelerate the mechanisms for accountability for Min Aung Hlaing and for other perpetrators.
The bill is scheduled for its second reading in the House of Lords on July 17. What challenges remain in securing cross-party support in both houses of Parliament?
Well, I've been encouraged that there is already quite a high level of cross-party support, particularly in the House of Lords, and we'll have to see, which way people vote. But I'm reasonably hopeful that there will be support from members on all sides. And then after it's passed its stages in the House of Lords, it would then go to the House of Commons. Obviously in the House of Commons it's more challenging because the government of the day has a majority, and unless they support the bill, they can encourage their members to vote against it if they oppose it. So ideally I hope the government itself will support this bill, but if they don't, I hope at least they will stay neutral and not actively oppose it, and give their own members in the House of Commons the freedom to vote according to their own consciences. And certainly I'll be working very hard alongside others to encourage as many members of Parliament in both houses on all sides to support it.
What message would you like to send to lawmakers who may be hesitant because of trade or diplomatic considerations?
Well, I would say, of course, trade matters, and of course we're in challenging economic times, so I understand why economic interests will feature in people's thinking. But trade should never be at the cost of genocide. We shouldn't be trading with countries or regimes that are perpetrating what's known as the crime of crimes. I mean, genocide is the worst crime under international human rights law. And surely anyone with a conscience would agree that no matter how important trade or diplomatic relations are, we shouldn't be silent on genocide.
To return to China for a moment, how do you see its role in the Myanmar crisis going forward?
I think it's a very big role and a very troubling role. I think that it is clearly the one power that is keeping this regime in power. And unless the rest of the international community really step up, then Myanmar will essentially become China's playground. It will become potentially a satellite state of China, and I think that's a very dangerous situation, not just for Myanmar, but for the rest of the world. So I think it's in everyone's interests for the rest of the world to step up and counter China's influence.
Finally, what message would you like to send to the international community regarding Myanmar?
I think my message would be Myanmar is not some faraway country that we know nothing about or that doesn't matter. It is a country that matters significantly geopolitically because of its location, because of China's influence there, but also it's a country that has struggled for so many decades with civil war, but also struggled for democracy. And of course it had a brief window of opening towards democracy, the 10-year period when Thein Sein introduced some political reforms, and then Aung San Suu Kyi won elections and was in government. And so it's had a taste of democracy. And I think the rest of the world owes it to the people of Myanmar to support their desire to not just return to that fragile democracy, but actually establish a genuine and long-lasting democracy for all its people. So the international community, it's in its own interest to act, but it also has a moral responsibility to act to support the people of Myanmar to be free and to be at peace.
Benedict Rogers, the Senior Director at Fortify Rights, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.